It's hard to compartmentalize some of those things. We can obviously kind of separate how we're feeling from the work that we do, but I'm suggesting that in small and subtle ways it bleeds over. So I think another part of becoming self-aware as a leader is maybe doing your own work. How is your personal life showing up in your work life? What are those impacts? What are those situations?
Over the long haul, our outward effectiveness as leaders cannot and will not outpace our inner health. I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Christopher O'Reilly. Christopher is an executive team member at Onsite Partners. Many people are familiar with Onsite as an internationally recognized name in the world of emotional wellness. Its work has been featured on ABC's 2020, Good Morning America, and in publications such as the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. But what you may not know is that in addition to its heralded programs, Onsite also has a residential facility called Milestones, which focuses on trauma and addiction treatment. And Milestones is led and run by our guest today, Christopher O'Reilly. Christopher has a master's degree in clinical counseling and over 20 years of clinical experience. As you will hear, he has a unique focus on wellness as it pertains to leadership, not only through his experience as a clinician, but also through leading other clinicians who are doing the hard work of helping to bring leaders back to a place of stability and health. In this episode, you will hear Christopher's perspective on the need for leaders to pause for self-reflection. You'll get a healthy dose of the word self-awareness, and you'll hear about the connections Christopher sees between our private lives and our ability to lead well in any given moment, especially as it pertains to stress. But first, we begin by learning about a leader who saw more in Christopher than he saw in himself.
There was a guy that I worked with for almost 20 years. He hired me and kind of gave me a ton of opportunities professionally over the years. His name's David Rotenberg. He's somebody that not only gave me opportunities, but he saw things in me that I don't think I saw in myself. So, inviting me to step into positions I didn't feel qualified for, and he supported me throughout all of those transitions. And, just to have that person who believes in you and sees things in you that you don't see in yourself is always very helpful, especially as a young leader. He immediately sticks out to me for what he provided me, but also just watching him with other people. He was very personal in his approach to leadership. People followed him because they trusted him, not because of what he said or his position. It was really the relationship, which I thought was foundational.
What's really interesting about that answer that to me that connects with so many other answers that we hear from folks when they're sharing with us a little bit about who's most influenced them from a leadership standpoint is that idea of being given opportunities before we're ready. I hear that over and over and over again. I think all of us at some point, if we've worked for a really good leader, did that. Unfortunately, there's some of us that didn't get to work for a great leader and don't know what that feels like to be brought into a room where you're like, man, I don't think I belong here, but thank you. let me jump in. And I just find it interesting to go a step beyond, okay, they believed in me. Yes. But I think every single one of those leaders had enough interpersonal security to pull people above their station and also be able to say, you know what? If this goes to hell in a handbasket, it's going to be okay. I'm going to be okay, because there's so many people that don't do that because they're afraid of their own reputation being on the line. But I hear this over and over again, that the great leaders pulled us into positions before maybe it looked like we were ready.
Yeah, I think so, Tim. And I've over the years done the same thing with people that I saw potential in, because it's one of those ideas that, mistakes are such learning opportunities. It's not really things can go right or things we can learn from. And he believed that, and nothing is perfect as you're, growing in a leadership role. But when things did get challenging, he was right there to kind of help through it. And even just had faith that I would figure some things out.
Well, it's always fun when you see somebody that believes in you and then they themselves don't get in the way of that invitation. In fact, they go the opposite direction. I'm thinking back on Shout out to Mike Kane if you're listening, in my own life, he did the very same thing. Took me to places I didn't deserve yet to be. Well, I'm excited about keying off of leadership here, and to dig in further. You do some really special work in the mental health space and connected to the issue of leadership. And we don't generally address current events on this podcast. We're usually sticking to the tried and true things that are connected to leadership. And yet, in this case, I think we get both, because mental health has been so much more at the forefront, especially coming out of the pandemic. And as we talk about it relating to leadership, but I would contend that it is a long-term, forever principle of being able to lead well. We just didn't talk about it as much as we have over the near term. So lead us into this conversation, given your background, given the work that you get to do with leaders.
Tim, I found a real parallel between the work that we do with clients, folks that are in mental health crises and needing to work towards stabilization and healing, and the ways in which we help people to get healthier or stabilize in their mental health. There's a lot of those skills and strategies that can be applied to leadership. And one of the ways that it became super clear to me is when I got a role as the leader of a team of therapists in a mental health treatment center. One of the things that we realized really quickly that there's something called vicarious trauma. And if somebody is providing treatment and they are on the receiving end of a lot of emotion and stress, like being a therapist, if they don't manage that properly, if they don't find an outlet for that, if they don't take care of what it feels like to hold all of that, then their performance and their ability to do their job starts to decline. So we created systems. And when I say created systems, I don't think we were the first to do this, but I think within our organization, we created systems that provided support and really the ability for therapists to gain some self-awareness. Like, what is happening in me when I'm doing this kind of work with people that are really struggling? And what happened was it helped clinicians to be more grounded, to stay objective, and to be, quite honestly, self-aware. How is the work impacting me? And so take that to like the next level. How do you create systems and ways of supporting leaders in an organization that they are more self-aware, they know how to manage their stress, and they stay more grounded and objective in their work? Those types of leaders tend to have better results, and they tend to have better relationships with their teams, which again leads to better results for the organization. So just lots of parallels on how people get well in healing mental health and how leaders can lead more effectively.
It's hard for me not to think about the old adage around putting your oxygen mask on first at a certain level when I hear that. As you think about leading clinicians that are helping people get back to a place of stabilization, but recognizing the toll it takes on them, and then drawing the parallel over into the leadership space. We have to have something to give in order to give.
That's right.
And if my cup is completely empty, I'm not going to be able to pour very well into somebody else. And we see that as valuable in life. We see that as valuable in relationships. And we also see that as valuable in leadership. Going further into this, given what you've been able to see over the years, is there anything that you would say is particularly unique about staying in a place of mental health when it comes to being a leader?
The first thing that comes to mind for me, Tim, and I'm going to call it a practice because I don't think it's something you have or you don't have. But I think when leaders can develop a practice of self-awareness, that tends to keep them in a position of being highly effective and being able to connect with their team in a way that they can't if they're not self-aware. So that's kind of like the broader statement. But I think, what does self-awareness mean from a leadership perspective? For me, do leaders know how they're being perceived by their teams? Do leaders know how they're being perceived by their customers? Do leaders have emotional intelligence? There's this concept in the clinical world, and I think we can pull it into the leadership conversation too, around projection, right? If a leader is struggling, let's say with an anger issue, Do they know when that anger comes out sideways in a way that's ineffective within their team or with their customers? Do they have self awareness of what's the root of that anger? Do they know when it's coming out? Do they know the fact that others perceive them as angry? So the self awareness is so important because you can't fix a problem if you don't know it exists.
Basically, what that says to me, I'm not going to end up self aware as a leader without some intentionality. It's not the natural order of things. So, what are your thoughts about helping leaders move towards a space of greater self awareness?
First thing, I have this fear that I've watched leaders who, when their teams are in front of them, they present one way, and the minute the leader walks out the door, they behave a different way. It's almost as if they don't have trust and respect in their leader, and they might present well, but then they're not doing so well. They don't have high opinions when the leader leaves. And there's just this big discrepancy between what the leader believes their team's connection that might be there and the feelings that they have towards them. But then the minute they leave, it's a different, they're in the dark, so to speak. I think that's a really dangerous place if leaders are in that, where they're the last person in the room to know. I think there's a couple different ways that leaders can, again, practice self awareness. Coming from a place of curiosity is really important when it comes to self awareness. It's when you take that extra time as a leader, maybe after a meeting, and saying, like, hey, what did you hear from me? Not just the words coming out of my mouth, but the energy, the underlining messages. It's when a leader takes the time to ask questions with a ton of curiosity rather than just maybe providing their teams with the plan. You can either be curious as a leader and really wonder how they're coming across and what are their blind spots, or you can be right. And it's hard to be curious and right at the same time. And I understand that there's certain times where there wasn't a lot of time to be super curious, but that's a strategy that I think leads to a lot of self awareness. And I think leaders need to take time to be reflective too. How am I showing up? How are others perceiving me? And here's a really big question that I would encourage all leaders to ask him is how much of my own struggles are showing up in the workplace? If a leader is struggling with mental health issues or addiction issues, or maybe they have some unresolved things that they probably should see a therapist about, it's hard to compartmentalize some of those things. And, we can obviously kind of separate how we're feeling from the work that we do, but I'm suggesting that in small and subtle ways it bleeds over. So I think another part of becoming self aware as a leader is maybe doing your own work. Therapy can be great, but maybe even having a mentor, maybe having a supervisor where you can really kind of talk about things that are going on. How is your personal life showing up in your work life? What are those impacts? What are those situations?
It seems like an important but almost a tough question to get at because if I'm a leader, I'm listening to this discussion and I'm saying, okay, I know I've got some challenges over here that are not specifically in the workplace. And I'm trying to deal with those as best I can, whatever that might be, a fractured relationship, an addiction, whatever it is. I'm dealing with something over here on the personal side, and I'm not fully aware of its significance. Who do you check in with? How do you find out if your full life, whether it's inside the walls of this business or not, how do you find out if that's kind of bleeding into all these different areas of your life and making you less healthy and less effective?
Yeah, I think, again, back to the curiosity piece, you could certainly have relationships within the organization, maybe not with like your direct reports, but just kind of trying to get a sense of how you're showing up. Can you have relationships where you can honestly give feedback after meeting? Maybe, if you're the CEO of a company with COO or something like that, end of meeting, like, how did that messaging come across? What energy did I bring? So it's, again, looking at that with curiosity. And if there's people in your personal life that are sharing concerns about potential addictive behavior or maybe anger issues, whatever it might be, again, hear that with curiosity versus defensiveness and be willing to get in there and look at it. Tim, with all the things that we're talking about, there's a variable that I think sort of touches on all of this. A question I love to ask leaders is, do you know how stressed you are or not? Self-awareness around stress is a key thing because if stress is in check, that's going to keep you in a more centered place and being more objective and being more effective as a leader. And awareness around stress is probably one of the key things that we as leaders can pay attention to. And it can be as simple as, on a scale from 1 to 10, where's my stress level? And stress impacts the way that we think. We can feel stress in our body. We can notice stress in how it impacts just day to day stuff like how well we're sleeping. I don't know about you, Tim, but when I'm stressed, I have less patience and tolerance with the people around me. There's a lot of indicators of stress, and that's a really key thing to kind of be aware of it. Because then the next question is if you recognize your stress is at a 7 or an 8, then what do you need to do to bring it back down to a 4 or 5? Here's an idea for leaders out there. Take 5 minutes and put your to-do list on pause and just pay attention to what's happening, meaning, how am I sleeping? Do I feel any tightness or tension in my body? I know for me, when I get stressed, I feel a ton of it in my shoulders. Stress can also feel like tightness in the chest. Your body will tell you a whole lot in regards to stress. The real question is, can we pause long enough to notice? There's a lot of information in the body, but we typically don't pay attention to it because we're very much focused on our thoughts.
As we're kind of digging into the issue of stress, and we've touched on the issue of self-awareness, and these two things certainly playing major roles from a leadership standpoint. Given your decades of work in this space, what are some other aspects of mental health that you see as really critical when it comes to leaders being their best?
To be in a place that you feel stable and grounded, there's a sense of presence, Tim, meaning being able to deal with what's in this moment, right here, right now. I think when leaders are constantly thinking about 6 steps forward, they miss a lot that what's happening here and now. And so even in the periods of stress or when there's a lot to do and there's building and preparing and planning from a mental health position, how can a leader show up and be present? Again, whether it's with customers or with their teams, because we all know what it feels like to be in front of someone that is distracted and someone who is not present. I hate to say this, but sometimes I feel like it's a sacred moment. In 2024, if you can get someone's undivided attention, where they're truly like with you, not looking at their phone, you can tell they're not distracted and they're just showing up in that moment. It feels almost like a sacred experience.
Yeah. I think to piggyback off of that, one of the things we talk with our clients around when we talk about the idea of being attentive. And our definition for that is being fully present to and fully engaged with others in every interaction. And when I ask people what gets your attention about that definition, the comments are usually the same. It's fully, fully, and every. They're like, yeah, I'd like to be not fully present, but mostly. I'd like to be not fully engaged, but for the most part. And maybe not every interaction, but most of them. And therein lies the rub.
Yeah.
But one of the other things that we share with them is just what you were alluding to right there. In 2024, as compared to, say, 1994, the number of people, let alone leaders, who are able to be fully attentive to another person in a given moment has to be catastrophically lower than it's ever been, at least here in the Western developed world, with all of the things that are pushed at us. But here's the good news, in my opinion. That means it takes less to stand out than it's ever taken. All you have to do, not that it's as easy as I'm saying it, but all you have to do is be fully here. That's all you have to do. And people won't necessarily say, oh my goodness, Christopher, he's just so attentive. They're going to feel it more than they're going to articulate it, I think. But it seems to me, while it's a more distractible world than we've ever been in before, it's also the easiest moment in time to stand out, especially as a leader who everybody assumes is too busy, doesn't have time, is too many things on their plate. If you just zone in and you're with somebody, I think you'll set yourself apart in about 10 seconds from all the other leaders. So, in one hand, it's a terrible news. On the other hand, I almost think hey, it's never been easier to stand out.
No, I think you're 100% right. And I think people can feel it. I really think that they can feel it. And I feel like they see something different. They feel something different. But most importantly, they feel like they matter. And I think when you can show up for your team in the way we're discussing, I think you're going to create a culture that feels supported and they're going to be more motivated to do whatever the mission, there's going to be buy-in on a different level. If people feel that the leaders in an organization care about them, and let's be honest, caring means people just want to be seen. I shouldn't say just, but that's a big piece of it. And they're going to feel that. And I think it's going to be worth its weight in gold in regards to culture.
If you haven't been able to catch our podcast with Zach Mercurio, who talks about this mattering concept, please go back and check that out. It's going to connect right in here with what Christopher's talking about. But I'm also being reminded of an opportunity a few months ago. I had a chance to be in a room with about 100 leaders from an organization. It's a multinational organization. And we spent time talking about this idea of being attentive. And the president of the company, again, it's a pretty sizable organization. So you want to think, oh, very, very sophisticated. But he got up in front of the whole room as an $8 billion multinational company and started talking at length about being attentive. And the story he told was brilliant. He talked about him, who's running this global enterprise, going to dinner parties and shaking hands with people. And as they're shaking hands, the person that he's engaging with is looking around the room to see who else they might need to go connect with. And what it felt like in that moment to not even have somebody's attention for 3 seconds, to say hello. And then he had some pretty funny choice words for that experience, with the other person that got us all laughing. But it was such an incredible point because you might think, oh, here's a person that's running an enormous organization globally. Surely everybody gives that person the time of day. And he said, nope, not even me. It doesn't even get to me. And then he just started doing the what if thing. And it was so profound to stand. I felt like such a privilege to be in the room, to listen to a senior leader challenge people in a global organization to say, let's pay attention to one another. Let's pay attention to each other. And I felt special to get a chance to be in the room and to hear him address his team like that.
That's awesome. And it's kind of, to me, it's like, can we get back to basics and can we focus on the things that are foundational when it comes to relationships and building a culture within an organization? I remember a time when everyone would talk about how great they are at a multitasker, right? Like, and I can do 8 things at once,
Right.
but if you really think about it, Tim, another way to look at multitasking is constant partial attention. And there's just so much that can be missed. And I don't think we're created to do that or to be able to pull that off, but especially relationally, because again, people feel that. I've had teammates where we've had to kind of set some ground rules where, people put their phones down. I've even worked on teams where we took 3 minutes of the beginning of a meeting and did some mindfulness exercises. And it wasn't for any other reason than to let go of where we just came from, whatever meeting, and truly create a pause and recenter, feel your body, and then be present for this next meeting. And that was truly the intention, because our minds have the ability to be in the past and in the future, and it's a gift and a curse. And I think there's times where we have to really work at bringing it into this moment. And I think it leads to creativity. I think it leads to more productivity. I mean, there's a ton of interesting research out there. I got really interested there's a group out there, and Jim Dietmar is one of the head guys, but it's the Conscious Leadership Group. And all of their research and all of their leadership training is very specific on being present and being self-aware. And I saw them at it was like a mindfulness leadership summit in Washington, D.C., probably like 7 or 8 years ago. And his keynote was profound. And then I did a deep dive on some of their research and some of the work that they'd done. And I have found it to be formative for me as a leader. And I love to teach it and talk to people about it because I think it makes a huge difference.
We'll be sure to put a link in the show notes to Conscious Leadership Group. It's interesting as we look at, you mentioned multitasking, and, I've been in those conversations where people will talk about how busy they are and how they just have so much going on. And not to be offensive to people, but just to maybe equally offend everybody if it applies to you. If we don't have time to pay attention to other people, then I think we simply don't have time to be good leaders. I mean, at the end of the day, if we're just so darn important that we can't pay attention to the people around us, then in the long run, it's going to really impact our relationships. And then you've got the whole other side of it, the whole body of work and research now that shows the inefficiency of multitasking from a brain standpoint. Your brain is not a computer. A computer was designed to run multiple programs at the same time. We tell ourselves we're multitasking, but to your point, what we're really doing is partial attention along the way. And it's amazing what that does to both our productivity and the quality of our work. We think we're getting more done. We're actually getting less done. We're doing it less effectively, and it's creating a whole lot more stress. And in the end, that's just what I say to folks. I mean, who wants to be worse? Who wants to be dumber? And who wants to get less done? Raise your hand. Like, okay, if you're in for it, then multitasking is the road to those things, in addition to the fact that it hurts relationships. So it's a crazy thing that we adopted into so many years ago. I mean, maybe it wasn't crazy. We just didn't know what we didn't know, but we know better now. And we need to put that into play. And one of the amazing feedback points that I hear from folks as we're working around this idea is the freedom that they experience when they stop multitasking. There's a stress reduction when I'm not trying to do two things at once, check on something while I'm writing an email. When people begin to intentionally take those kinds of things out of their lives, there's a whole lot of things that get better, including their own level of stress. So if you want a little more freedom in your spirit, also say no to multitasking because it's going to impact you.
I like what you just said, Tim, because you're talking about overall productivity. You're talking about overall wellness for the leader and the teams and the culture. And you're also talking about relational enhancement. So I really think those are three key areas that are really important, right? It's like a no-brainer. I think there's the part of it is having trusting that you can do one thing at a time and the wheels won't come off the bus. I think that's the biggest barrier that people don't have faith in that you can block schedule things and like do one thing at one time. And I've actually found that if I have a 10-minute conversation with someone, I'm fully present versus I'm multitasking or I'm distracted, then I have to go back and revisit things and then they didn't really understand what I was saying. There's so much to clean up and backtrack and it's just not worth it. It's really not.
It's a great point. Well, before we get to some of our final thoughts, if folks want to seek you out, get a hold of you, what is the best way for them to be able to find you?
So currently, my role, I am part of the executive team at Onsite Workshops here in Nashville, and people could find me there. And Onsite is a place that is focused on treating mental health, but they also do leadership stuff, and they're just about overall wellness. So they're, I think, a great resource for any leader that's interested in learning more about emotional intelligence or even just becoming more self-aware. I run a residential trauma treatment center, and the folks that come to the place where I work, they are high functioning. Some of them, they're public figures. Sometimes they run 10 different companies. They have important positions. And what is a common theme for a lot of them is that they feel like they're too busy and they have too many balls in the air to slow down and take care of themselves. It's like a runaway train in a lot of ways. So, my imparting thoughts is that the things that maybe you do have some self awareness that are creating stress in your life, they're affecting your mental health, they're difficult. Like some people are highly effective at work, but then their personal lives might be falling apart or they don't know how to manage their stress. And it's just taking the time to slow down and asking for help. It's not something that's just going to go away. The stress that we're feeling, the issues that we're experiencing, the longer we wait to deal with them as leaders, the worse it's going to get to the point where things could come crashing down. And if work life is okay, but yet personal life is really struggling, even in those circumstances, eventually the personal stuff is going to catch up to the work stuff. So I strongly encourage leaders that things that are creating stress and problems that you're facing, don't avoid them because they're going to get worse. They're not just going to kind of dissipate. So it's almost just like a warning that, and an encouragement. And there's a trusting that you can put energy into the things that are creating problems for you. And my strong encouragement, yeah, please do, because what might be a smaller issue now will only become a bigger issue over time. When it comes to leadership, it's such a win-win kind of thing, because if you take the time and energy to evolve as a human, become more self-aware, take care of yourself better, people can feel that. There's a groundedness that comes with that. People who are well emotionally and self-aware, it's going to make you more effective as a leader. So I would hope that leaders can make that a priority and even create a culture of emotional health within their organizations. And I'm not talking about like having an EAP. I'm talking about creating a culture where not only are we talking about and focusing on the work that needs to be done, but can you create space to just like, hey, how are we doing as a team? Are we trusting one another? Are there issues within our culture that need attention? And sometimes you need a consultant to help you kind of understand that, as I know you understand, Tim, in the work that you do. But I can't speak to the value of that enough, because an unhealthy culture within a work organization is going to impact the bottom line, and it's going to impact retention rate. It's going to impact the quality of the product or the service. There's no shortcuts. You have to deal with the things at hand.
As we wrap up our visit with Christopher O'Reilly, there are a few things that I want to take some moments here to emphasize. And the first one just has to do with mental health and leadership in general. I think many of us might look in the mirror and say, hey, there's nothing here that necessarily seems out of place. But wouldn't it be better for all of us, but especially those of us who have influence from the seat of leadership, to have a different standard? When we think about being healthy, when we think about our physical health, we understand that there's always a next level to go to if we want to. And I wonder if we couldn't also begin to apply that to the mental health space as well, as opposed to, I'll talk with somebody, I'll see somebody if I feel like I'm going over the edge. What if instead we had the perspective of, how do I be my mental healthiest? And that we pursued that. What if that was our perspective? And in talking with Christopher, it just makes me think about that in general, as opposed to mental health being the ambulance that shows up when we've gotten ourselves into a pit or a hole. What if we were more proactive about it? What if we looked at it the same as we do our physical health, that we would treat and invest in our mental health just like we would when we're eating healthy or going out for a jog? So, a thought there for us to consider if we're going to reach our best, fulfill our potential as leaders. Another thing that I want to touch on, Christopher talked about this idea of having people you can process with. And that reminds me of a practice that we talk with our clients about when it comes to the issue of being secure and settled. Secure and settled being the opposite of being insecure. And one of the levers that we invite our clients to consider is something we call JFR. It's the practice of JFR. JFR stands for judgment free relationships. We all need people to whom we can share the whole story and not have to caveat everything we say. They know us well, and yet they're also somebody who is deep into the acceptance of who we are from the very beginning, even before they hear what we have to say. That's a judgment free friend. And one of the things that can help us be more secure and settled as human beings, and therefore then more effective as leaders, as we work towards being that port in a storm that everybody can count on, is having relationships, having judgment-free relationships that we prioritize on a regular basis, that help us process through, where we can just be unfettered and unbound and just say whatever it is that we need to say, with somebody who's not going to then bring a pile of judgment, but will be there present with us. That's a practice that can really add into and support the idea of becoming a more and more secure leader. So I wanted to mention that as we heard from Christopher talking about the idea of being able to process with people. And that actually leads me into my final thought. Christopher talked about the idea of taking time and having time to reflect. So in one regard, the judgment-free relationships are taking time to reflect with somebody else. But then there's also, as we all know, the opportunity to reflect on our own. And this is something that we, especially in Western culture, do not do well. We do not quiet ourselves. We do not quiet our devices. We do not pause often enough to just reflect. For many people, that reflection process involves a journal. And it doesn't have to be the way that you do it, but so many things happen in our brain function whenever we're writing down. It causes us not to have to be super tight with our thoughts like something's going to be published on air, but the act of writing does trigger a different type of response from our brain that causes us to enhance even our own learning. So I definitely recommend journaling if it's not something you regularly do, but there are other ways as well. There are other ways where you can just go a walk by yourself and have an agenda to have a conversation with yourself. For other people, it's actually related into this kind of self-reflection time to be a spiritual practice called prayer, where it's a conversation with God. There's a lot of different ways to approach the issue of reflection. And yet, I think the biggest issue of all when it comes to us as leaders is, are we taking the time to do it? Do we have a plan? Are we setting aside a time? Do we have a regular cadence? So all of that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today. And that is this: do you have a regular cadence and commitment to self-reflection? This is Tim Spiker reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you receive your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.